This is Melody Lehman, and I'm explaining procedures or protocol for the Brigance Inventory of Early Development for Kinesiology 4075. Um, the Brigance is a comprehensive assessment that is given to special education students. When I was a special education teacher, I utilized this assessment for my functional life skills students. I would use it typically at the triennial MDA evaluation meetings. There is a portion of physical development for gross motor and fine motor. As a special education teacher, I would administer the entire assessment. Sometimes it was shared with the PT, OT, and the APE teacher if they were on the team at that time. So I'm going to explain the gross motor skills subtests that are administered with the Brigance. There are fine motor ones, but typically the OT addressed a lot of those. The rest of the assessment does include language development, cognitive, academic, daily living skills, and social emotional development. But I will be addressing the gross motor. So the subtests for the gross motor are standing, walking, stairs and climbing, running, jumping, hopping, kicking, balance beam, catching, rolling, and throwing. Okay, so the assessment does come with a manual, and so you want to make sure that you have open space, but you also need a table to refer because the binder is like super thick, and you want to be able to have a private area for the students to be able to demonstrate all of those tasks. If you don't have access to stairs or safe ones, because doing some of these assessments in the school environment and it's not on carpeted stairs can be kind of risky for students that struggle physiologically or have any type of impairment physically. You can do interviews with a parent and ask them about their ability to stand, walk, and climb and do things of that nature. But it's best if you can observe the student within their actual PE class if they're of age, or to actually implement the test yourself. So you will use a stopwatch to time the test. So for example, we'll start with the standing. You would prompt the student to stand on one foot with one hand held. The teacher would actually hold one hand to provide balancing support, and you would say stand on one foot, and you would demonstrate this for the student and you would pick up one of your feet. The next task would be stand on the other foot, and you would hold their hand to provide supported balance. The third task is to stand on tippy toes momentarily, and so you can demonstrate all of these before actually having the student do it. If the student doesn't actually establish a balanced, stable position on one foot, or when they're up on their tippy toes, then you can't award them credit. Then you would actually prompt the student to stand on one foot by themselves. You would demonstrate this for the student. Same rules apply. If the student never establishes a clear balance, then you do not give them credit. You do it for both feet. And then you actually do it for time. So stand on one foot for 1 second. Give the student credit for demonstrating that. Allow the student 2 trials. Then you would progressively get longer, and you would have the student stand on one foot for 5 seconds. Then 10 seconds. Then you have the student attempt it with their eyes closed. The cool thing about each subtest is they give you examples of if a student has a deficit in these areas. They have examples of ways for you to write the IEP goal. So, for example, you would say in 36 instructional weeks, when requested to do so and demonstrated by the teacher, Johnny will stand on one foot with one hand held. And so it helps you to write IEP goals. So typically a lot of teachers utilize that. And sometimes in the past, I've utilized that as the objectives to the overall arching goal, that the student will maintain a standing position on one foot for 10 seconds, but then the lead up to that are the objectives. So, moving on. The next is an assessment for walking, and I'm going to just kind of like breeze over it. Otherwise, this video is going to be very, very long if I explain every single subtest. So, when giving directions for this portion of the assessment for walking, you can do an interview, but then you can also demonstrate the student to see if they walk well without falling, if they can walk sideways with 2 steps, and you would actually demonstrate this if you couldn't actually see the student do it. So you would say, walk like this, and you demonstrate it for the student, and then count the number of steps that they have. You can observe the student or demonstrate for them to walk erect with synchronous and arm swing, so essentially opposite arm and leg. Then you would have the students walk backwards. And a lot of these you would have to demonstrate. It's not typical motion for most kids. You would count how many steps that they can take backwards, and then you would eventually calculate how far. And so when I've done this before, I actually had a measuring tape out, so then you could clearly see if the student was walking backwards 6 feet or 2 meters, like it states in the assessment. You actually ask the student to walk on their tiptoes 3 steps. Typically what I find with any of these assessments, if a student has a language impairment of any sort, it can be challenging to give any of the assessments, whether it would be the Brigance or total gross motor. It's difficult to give the assessments if the students have receptive language issues. So like students on the spectrum, students with a language disability, cognitive disability. So you have to rely a lot on demonstration. So the next task would be for the student to walk on a straight line. You can use lines in the gym, or you can tape your own down if for some reason you're administering this somewhere else. Walk forward, heel and toe 3 steps. I just try and demonstrate, I exaggerate the heel toe. The students that I've given this assessment to struggle with that if they're on the spectrum. A lot of times they're very much on their toes, so they can walk on their toes when asked to, but they struggle going heel toe. You'd calculate how many steps they can take or the distance that they take. You would also ask the students to walk backwards, which this one seems to be pretty challenging. It's actually challenging for me to demonstrate it without messing it up. So some of the possible objectives or goals for a student that might have a deficit in this area would be in 36 instructional weeks when requested to do so and demonstrated by a teacher. Johnny will walk on tiptoes for 4 steps, or walk in a straight line for 4 steps, and we typically do with 80% accuracy as a general proficiency rate. But for some of my lower functioning students that are receiving PT, we have a lot lower percentage. Next, it's stair climbing. So this you can do during an interview with a parent. You would ask them, how does Johnny climb or go upstairs? If this is more of a child find situation or one of the transitions where a kid is at a child development center and you have the opportunity to go in the home, you can observe and watch this yourself. You want to interview about their ability to creep upstairs, to be able to creep downstairs, to walk up the stairs, to walk down the stairs. If they're using both feet, if they're alternating. So like I said, if you don't have the ability to interview the parents about this situation, you can do it in the school environment. I would just suggest being very careful with your stairs. Okay, the running assessment. You're going to observe the student running during organized activities. So the student would be observed within their PE class, possibly at recess, but you want to make sure that you're communicating with the PE teacher and setting up for them to have a good amount of activity time so you can observe everything that you need to see. So the things that you want to look for are, does the student run stiffly? Are they clumsy? Do they fall? Do they actually have a flight phase where both their feet actually come off the ground? Do they lean forward, or is their weight on the balls of their feet? Are their arms moving contralaterally, so opposite arm, opposite leg? You would try to see if you can observe some of the other locomotor skills, but those might have to actually be prompted by stimuli, if you will, and actually set up as its own subtest. I'm not going to go over an example for objectives for writing the IEP. So next subtest is jumping. So you'd actually ask the student to perform these. It'd be difficult to actually observe it because you'd want to see some repetition. So you'd ask the student to jump with one hand held, so you'd actually help them do it. Then you have them jump without holding onto their hands. Then the next step is that you have the student jump with both feet independently. You'd actually demonstrate it. You want them to then jump over a small object. So when I've done this before, I use like a noodle, so it's safe. But you can use smaller things. They suggest like a chalkboard eraser, which it just kind of confuses the kids. I've had noodles on the floor for the kids before to jump over, so that's what I've utilized. You want them to do a broad jump. So I've actually used poly spots to demonstrate how you go from point A to point B. And that typically helps them understand that they're going from one position to the next. I don't think it invalidates the test in any way. Then you want them to jump consecutively, so you have them jump 4 times, and you would demonstrate this for them. You want them to do a broad jump over an object or a string. So typically I just, like I said, either use a noodle or I just have them jump over a line. Then you want to see if you can get them to go for distance. So you're going to try for like 10 inches. So you can use the measuring tape if you'd like, but like my poly spots are about that big. So if they can jump over a poly spot, then it's about 10 inches. Then the next thing is you're going to have the students jump forward 10 times, and then the next is jump backwards once. Following that, you want them to jump 3 times consecutively, but this is actually with a rope. So when you're actually jumping rope, it gets pretty difficult with your younger age learners. So for some of my students, we do what's called zeroing out. So if they couldn't actually get to a certain level of the test, then we zero them out. And so I've done this with a lot of our standardized tests, or even just with progress monitors. If it's a progressive assessment, that eventually the complexity gets harder and harder. Once they get to a certain level that they no longer are successful 3 times in a row, then we don't continue on with the test, because then the student gets pretty frustrated, and then they just deal with lack of success. Okay. I mean, in the end, you want the student to be able to jump 10 times consecutively with a rope, which is pretty challenging even for my typical age, like first graders. So just be aware developmentally what the assessment is actually telling you. And if a student is able to actually accomplish that, then typically they're in a situation where they can experience inclusion with minimal support. Okay, moving on. So, just like the jumping tasks, you're going to prompt the students to do hopping next. So, you're going to have the students hop with a preferred foot. Then you actually have the students hop on the other foot. Then you're going to go to a distance of 10 feet on the preferred and 10 feet on the non-preferred foot. So typically if a student can hop, then they have the ability to then skip. The majority of my students that can't hop, I'm not going to try and assess them on skipping, which is one of the locomotor skills that's in some of the other assessments. And it's also one of the standards for the K2 span in PE. But obviously I don't want to waste the students' time or make them feel unsuccessful trying to do it. Okay. The next assessment is kicking. So you ask the students to perform the skills and you demonstrate them. You'd say things like kick the ball. And so you would need definitely a wide open area. And I typically use more of a kickball, so it's soft. And I don't keep it completely inflated. So then you're not chasing after the ball a lot. What's next? Some of this you can observe. They actually suggest you observe possibly on the playground, but I like to do it in a structured setting so I can actually stimulate and set up the situation to demonstrate what I want to see. So some of the questions they have are, does the student coordinate kick with a good backward and forward leg swing? Does the student take 2 or more coordinated steps in kicks? Does the student run forward and kick the ball? And then it wants you to evaluate how far away you are. So, moving on. So then the next one is balance. So you can use a low balance beam. So you want the student to actually do this test without their shoes on. So you're going to say walk on the balance beam, and then you have them demonstrate it. Then next you say stand on the balance beam, walk on the balance beam with hands at your side, and then you demonstrate doing it actually heel toe for them and asking them to do so. The next assessment is catching. So a lot of the catching tasks are with a tennis ball, which I just struggle with some of these assessments because it is a pretty small implement. And even typical age peers in elementary are going to struggle with a tennis ball, but that's the assessment. So you're going to stand 6 to 8 feet away from the student. And you're going to demonstrate, catch it with your hands like this. And you try and demonstrate using your hands instead of trapping it with your chest. You actually do it off the bounce, and you need to record, you need to record if the student is actually trapping it or utilizing their hands. So last one is rolling and throwing. So with this, you're going to use a tennis ball. You're going to throw the ball by holding it back, the back of your head like this. You would actually demonstrate the throwing motion. And then you would observe the student. You want to observe and see if the student can throw it, if the student can roll it back and forth while in a seated position with you. So I would actually start with the rolling before I would do the throwing. Then you would document if the student can throw the tennis ball in a coordinated fashion. So being able to step contralaterally. Can the student throw it a distance of 10 feet? Do they actually bring their elbow back and throw it? Can they throw it a distance of 20 feet? And do they actually shift weight in a mature fashion when they throw? So if they have trouble like grasping and things like that, this assessment could be very difficult. So sometimes I have used bigger implements before just to see if that's the issue. But other than that, okay, so that completes the gross motor. So like I said previously, a lot of people use the Brigance to use at the MDA as an evaluation tool, but also it has an inventory that you can use to kind of progressively write IEP goals, which is very helpful. So this is assessment that I previously used regularly as a special education teacher and would as an APE teacher. When explaining where the students score, I would actually give a lot more hard examples, because with this test, I think parents can understand specifically what you had them do, and you can talk to them about their deficits in, say walking, what they could or could not do, or hopping and things like that. It does have standard scores that typically are going to be expressed during the evaluation piece. But I would really use raw examples of what the student may or may not be able to do and how that's going to drive the IEP goals. Okay.